Hello and welcome to the video. My name is Mark Lassoff from Framework Television. So glad you're here. In this video, you're going to be learning how to create an API-based application with JavaScript. We're actually going to be using 3 related technologies to create this application. The first is, of course, JavaScript for all the interaction. But we also need to use HTML5 for our application structure and CSS for the look and feel of the application. In addition, I'll be using a library called OnSendUI. And what that does is it gives me a number of UI components that look really good on a mobile device. I'm creating a mobile app today. You're going to learn how to create this application line by line. And in doing so, you'll learn how to work with simple APIs, and you'll learn how to use the OnSend library to create a really cool application. Ready to get started? Don't forget, if you enjoy these application videos, go ahead and smash the like button, leave a comment, or subscribe to the channel. Let's get started. I've got my code up here on the left. On the right, I've got my web browser open for testing, and my command line is pointed to the folder in which I have the code. So let's go ahead and run our simple HTTP server here. We're going to use the simple HTTP server program, and we're going to run this on port 8000. So this way we can access our application through localhost port 8000, and there's our app. That's a better way than running the app than loading the actual file into the browser, because this allows it to actually be served by a web server. All right, so let's choose a food to pair. We're going to go with steak. I'm going to click search. It contacts the API, and it returns a number of craft beer options that might go well with steak. You want to try a different one? Let's try chicken. Actually, let's refresh. We'll try it again. All right, chicken. And here are some beers that go well with chicken. So, of course, we're using the Punk API. Now, the Punk API is designed for learning. So the Punk API returns the information about all the beer. We can look at the documentation here. Now, the reason this is a good API for learning is it doesn't have a certain type of cross-site scripting security that many APIs have, so you avoid the whole hassle as you're learning to use it. And secondly, it doesn't require any authentication. Most secure APIs require a username, password, and account. This one doesn't, so it's perfect to learn the basics of API programming. And you can see here's all the documentation that I use to learn the API. The API is rather simple. Now, we're going to be doing food pairings, so we're going to be sending the API a food string. And you'll notice when I type here, I'm typing a food string, like fish, that gets sent to the API, and then the API provides us with information based on that query right there. All right, so you've seen it work a couple of times. I'm going to make my code a little bit bigger for you. And let's go ahead and see how the application is put together. Now, there's 3 application files that are relevant. The HTML file, which is our structure, that's only 25 lines right here. Our CSS file, which is the look and the feel, just 32 lines. And then our JavaScript, also under 40 lines. So fairly simple application to put together. Not a lot of code here, but you can see it does something useful and something fun without a whole lot of code. Let's start reviewing this line by line. So I'm going to start with the HTML. And all HTML exists in a basic document structure. Line 1 is called our doc type declaration. And here we're simply declaring that we're using HTML5 for this particular application. If we look at the next tag, that's our HTML opening tag. The HTML opening tag is what starts every HTML document. And of course, the HTML tag closes on line 25. Tags are in HTML in pairs. You always have an opening tag and a closing tag. So then we have our head section of the document, where we declare our character set as UTF-8. We title the document beer pairs. And then we have some information from the onSend UI. Lines 6, 7, and 8, I copied straight from the onSend UI. And what this does is it connects me to the CSS, the cascading style sheet information, and the JavaScript for onSend UI. onSend UI is an external library. Somebody else wrote it. I'm simply consuming it here so I can display the onSend components. So these 3 lines of code connect me to the onSend UI. Then I have a link to beer.css, and that's the CSS or cascading style sheet I wrote for custom styles beyond what the onSend UI could do. Then we have our closing head tag, and we open the body. Now the body is what contains everything you see here in the UI. So when we refresh, this is all that's in the body. This header right here that says beer pairings, our text field where we can enter the food to pair, like a burger, and the search button. The information about the beers comes dynamically, and we get that once we actually submit our burger or whatever choice we're making here to the Punk UI. All right, so then we have, since we're using onSend, we have some special tags. The way onSend works is it has a series of special tags and classes that you use to call the different onSend components. So you'll see some tags that aren't familiar to you if you know HTML. So for example, on line 12 is the ONS page tag. And this is calling an onSend page. So our entire document exists in an onSend page, which starts on line 12 and ends on line 22. This is really useful when we have more than one page in a document because we can switch pages and actually create different states in those pages. So if you have a complicated application, you can have multiple onSend pages. Think of it like a video game where you have the gameplay page, the title page, the high scores, etc. This is a simple application, just one page, so we only need one onSend page tag. Then we have our onSend toolbar on 13, 14, and 15, and that's what creates the toolbar here at the top of the document where it says beer pairings. And you can see I actually have that text right here. We then have a container, and the container contains everything below our actual toolbar. That's a container I put in there so I could isolate that content for markup and styling. Then we have our input. So right here, this ONS input is where the user gets to input their text. So that's right here where it says burger right now, and I'm going to type the word fish. So this is how it works. ONS input gives us the input. The ID food is something I made up to give it an ID so we can access it through the JavaScript later. Modifier underbar is what gives us this underbar look right here, that line at the bottom. It's called an underbar. The placeholder food to pair, that's what's in there if the user hasn't typed any text in there. I'm using the placeholder in lieu of a label. A lot of times you can label your individual inputs in a form. I'm doing it with an actual placeholder. It's a little more contemporary. You see more websites and applications using this style now. All right, so then we close the ONS input on line 18, and then we have our ONS button. I use the large modifier to create a button that goes all the way across the width of our application. I gave it the ID btn search, which we'll use in the JavaScript in a few minutes to actually access the button, and I wrote the word search on the button. So this text between the opening ONS button tag and the closing ONS button tag is what's written on the button. We could put Ernie and Bert here. It doesn't affect the actual functionality. Then I have on line 20 this empty div, ID'd as result. And what that is, it's a placeholder for us to put the information when it comes back from the API. So if we were to say pork, this div here on line 20 is where all this information appeared. Fake logger, that sounds interesting. So you've got all of these that came back, and they've actually been placed right there in the DOM, in the browser's memory. Close our section, close our page, and then I included the script that I wrote, the beer.js script. I've only recently started putting my scripts at the bottom of the page. It just saves a step because you know all your HTML is loaded when the JavaScript starts executing. So you don't have to include a JavaScript event to wait for everything to load. Just makes things a little bit simpler. So that's why I've started doing that. All right, so we've gone through the HTML. Let's take a look at the JavaScript. Again, under 40 lines, pretty straightforward. So the first things I'm doing when the JavaScript runs is I'm getting the elements from the HTML and I'm assigning them JavaScript names. So document getElementById btn search. What that's referring to is the search button right here. So in the JavaScript, that's called btn search. I created that as a constant because that's not going to change. There's not going to be any change to the value of btn search. There's not going to be any change to the value of txt search, which is where food to pair appears, where I just typed the word steak. The result area, again, also no change there, so that's defined as a constant, is that empty div where we're going to put our results. So getElementById result, if we look again at the HTML, this has the ID result. So it's simply an area I've reserved for our content to come in later. And by the way, when you create the content from another source using JavaScript, it's dynamic content. Any content that's just written in the HTML, for example, our title bar, our button, that's static content. So we've reserved a place for our dynamic content right here. All right, back to the JavaScript. I've created a variable here with let called out, and I've declared that with an empty string. That's going to change, and that's where we're going to store all the output as it's processed here in our JavaScript. Now, nothing happens in this app until the search button is clicked. So I've typed steak, I click the search button, and that's when the action takes place. So on line 6, I've attached to the search button an onClick event. And this function runs when the button is clicked. So the first thing that happens when the button is clicked is I get from txt search, right here, this input, its value. The value is the string that the user typed, in this case, steak. So I assign the word steak from txt_search.value to the variable search term. I then create this URL, https://api.punkapi.com/v2/beers?food=search term. So when this is done, this actually becomes, with what we've got now, API, punkapi.com, v2beers, food=steak, whatever we wrote there. So when we send this to the API processes it and comes back with all this. Now this probably looks like a mess to you. But what this is the JSON. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. And what it is a way of communicating between systems in a way that is non-proprietary. It doesn't matter whether the API is running on a Windows machine, a Mac, what language it's written in, because we're just going to exchange JSON. And that's plain text that contains all our information. So here on the screen, you can see the JSON that came back. That's the text. And my code processes that JSON, so it looks like this. So that's what the Punk API does. And again, we looked at the documentation here, and food requires a string. I also could have done, for example, a date and only got beers brewed before a certain date, or having a certain yeast. I'm not a beer expert, so I don't understand some of these, but I certainly understand food and pairings. All right, So that's why we're forming this URL. And again, this URL came from my documentation, and we're including the search term. So in the application then, this API is called, excuse me, this URL is called. It calls the API with our search term. Now, of course, we don't know how long it's going to take the API to process our information and respond. This is an asynchronous process. So since we don't know how long it's going to take the API to respond, we can't simply write one line after another and have it execute that way, because our code would execute faster than the API can respond with the JSON that we just saw. So here's what we do. We're using the fetch command and the URL. So the fetch is going to go to the URL, provide our food equals steak in this case, or whatever search term it is. And then when we get the data back, it's going to take that data, it's going to return that data as a JSON object, and then we're going to parse the JSON object here. So it almost reads like a sentence, right? Fetch this URL, then return the JSON object, then parse the JSON object with this function. So the way we parse the JSON object is with this for loop right here. So that's going to parse all the different pieces of JSON that came back, one for each beer, and it's going to process them one at a time. So when it processes them, we're going to call it the actual beer 0, beer 1, beer 2, right? If you look at this, these actually are numbered 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. It's very hard to see in this format, but we're looping through each individual beer. So we're looping through each individual item here. When we loop through it, we're getting from the JSON the name of the beer, the tagline for the beer, the description of the beer, and the URL of the image of the beer. So we're getting that for each one of these, and you can see that information appearing here. The name, the tagline, the description, and the image. So we're getting that out of the JSON. And if we look real carefully, we can see here in the JSON some of this information. Matter of fact, if we did a quick search, and we searched for tagline, you can see right here, tagline, America Barley Wine, Oscar Blues, and somewhere in here, America Barley Wine, Oscar Blues collaboration. So this is the information that was parsed from this very JSON. So this process is going through each beer, getting this information out. When we get this information out, we're putting it in an array with the name, the tagline, the description, and the image, and we're sending that to a function called beerout. So here's the beerout function. Now before I go over that, I also want to point out here that part of this structure here in our fetch catches any errors that may occur. And if there's an error, it outputs it to the console. If there's no error, this is ignored. But this is a catch. So we get fetch, then catch. This entire structure is known as a promise. All right, so here's beer out. This gets past each one of these individual beers. And what we do here with beer out is we disassemble the array into a logical division where we display the image. Look carefully at that HTML. So it's called beer image, and the image source comes from the URL right here. And we're essentially building the HTML. We're putting the beer's name in the H2 tag. We're putting the beer's tagline in the H3 tag, and the description here in paragraph and emphasis tags. We then close our divisions. So the code for each one of these is added to this variable out, right? So each one of these is a separate div that's added to this giant out variable. So what happens is we make a giant out variable that's got one of these divs with the information filled in for each beer. And here you can see all of these our different logical divisions that were held in the out variable. And then once we've built the out variable with every beer in the JSON, we go back to that result area and we set the inner HTML to the value of the out variable. And if we look here in our console, if you go to more tools here using Chrome and developer tools, we're actually able to see this information. Let's go ahead and get our HTML. And we're going to have to kind of dig in here, page content, container, and let's see, there it is, div ID result, and you can see all the individual beers here. And if we look carefully, this is the HTML that was built right here in this part of the code. So we have our beer image and our beer text right here. So this was built dynamically, stored in the variable called out, and then placed in the result area. So that's how that works. Now the actual styling was done by CSS, and that's what gave us these white boxes with the curved edges and displaying the beer in the right place, a little bit of drop shadow. So let's take a look at the CSS. This is the last file that's a major part of this application. So first off, I have a couple of IDs, food and container. And these are used in the HTML simply to set the width of the application and to give us some space between the edge of the application and our content. So you can see the margin here and the width. Again, just spacing the application. Now, each one of these is styled by this class beer starting on line 10, and you're able to see all the styles as we go here. First of all, a 1 pixel solid black border goes all the way around. Every one of these has that. A margin of 5 pixels, so there's 5 pixels between this and whatever's next to it, but at the bottom I allowed some additional pixels to spread these out a little bit more. Padding of 10 pixels between the edge and the actual content, so our text isn't right up against the border. The border radius of 5, giving us 5 pixel round edges, a background color of white, and this all is what's creating our shadow. I did include for older browsers here the WebKit and Mozilla versions. For most browsers, line 19 by itself will work fine. So what this simply says is how far offset my shadow is going to be on the left, right, top, and bottom sides, and then what color it is. And here what we're doing is a completely black drop shadow with 0.5 transparency, so it's half transparent. And that's what's giving us kind of the shadow effect that you can see around each of the boxes. Since this is the parent of the image and the text, right? The image and the text, I'm using Flexbox. If you haven't used Flexbox before, Flexbox is really the way you should be laying out content with CSS. It makes things much easier by targeting the parent object and the child object with certain CSS rules that control layout. This is a fairly simple layout because we only have the image and the text, but you can do much more complex layouts with Flexbox. So here with Flexbox, we create the display flex, and we decided we wanted to justify the content with the space between the text and the image. For the beer image side, we simply wanted a padding of 10 pixels and a width of 50 pixels. And order 1 means this is going to go on the right-hand side because the order starts with 0. So by default, the text would be 0. This is 1. And all I did here was set the image to a width of 60 pixels. So all of the images of the beer are 60 pixels. And that's what creates the layout. So a little bit of CSS manipulation really makes this look nice. Can't do anything about these broken links because this information came straight from the API. It means they're broken in the API. And that's one of the disadvantages of using an API is you don't have complete control, and sometimes you can get some bad content like we did for those links. That's why they're broken. All right, so this is a pretty cool application, and it's great for people who are just starting to create apps with JavaScript, who've learned the basics and really want to start delving into creating apps. It's fairly short, it teaches you how to use a simple API, and it's kind of fun. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Mark Lassoff. Don't forget, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment on the video. Thanks again. We'll see you next time.